Hello everyone, I'm Chess Tactics. Chess.com has recently created two new bots for us to play against. They are Nepo and Fabiano Caruana. So in this video, I made them battle against each other, and now let's see the game that they played. Okay, Nepo is white and Fabi is black. Nepo plays e4, Fabi plays c5 with the Sicilian defense. Nepo plays knight to f3. Fabi plays d6. Nepo plays knight to c3. And Fabi plays knight to f6. Nepo plays d4, striking in the center. And Fabi takes his pawn. Nepo plays queen takes d4 instead of knight takes d4. Knight to c6, attacking the queen by Fabi. Queen to d3. Pawn to e5. Bishop to e3. Bishop to e7. Now, what we have to notice is that black has a backward pawn on d6. This means that white has to control the square in front of the pawn, which is d5. White does this by playing queenside castles. Now, white has control over this square, which means that white is slightly positionally better than black. Black also has less space, and black's bishop is bad. So let's see what Fabi does to counter this. First, Fabi castles king side. Now we have an opposite castled king situation, which means that both sides will try to advance their pawns towards the enemy king, and it's in most of the time it is a race between these pawn rushes, the both attacks. Basically now Nepo just develops his light squared bishop to e2. Black also develops the light squared bishop with bishop to e6. Remember, the bishop is not attacking this pawn because of this knight. Now Nepo advances his pawn, which prevents this knight move and attacking this queen and this pawn. So Nepo plays pawn to a3. Fabi plays knight to g4, which attacks sorry which attacks white's dark squared bishop and threatens to knock off white's bishop pair. Nepo allows this but plays knight to d5, which also attacks black's bishop. Now Fabi ignores Nepo's threat and also doesn't take the dark squared bishop, but instead plays f5, which breaks the center open. Nepo takes the e7 bishop with check. Queen recaptures. Pawn takes f5. Bishop takes f5. This attacks the white queen. Queen takes d6, taking care of a pawn. Queen takes, rook takes. And now Fabi just plays rook to c8, and white is up a pawn. But Fabi is quick with the counterplay. Okay, bishop to c4 check, developing the bishop with tempo. King to h8. Bishop to e6, attacking the rook and the bishop and forcing a bishop trade. Bishop takes e6 and rook takes e6. Knight takes e3, swapping off a knight for a bishop. Okay, f takes e3, and now white and black both have isolated e pawns. Okay, rook to f6, offering a rook trade. White accepts, black takes back, and rook to d1. This takes control of the d file, while black has indirect control of this file. Okay, rook to c7. I don't know what that move does, but I guess it has a purpose. Now knight to d2, hoping to remaneuver the knight somewhere. Okay, pawn to f5, advancing the pawn. Rook to f1, taking advantage of the advanced pawn and attacking the pawn immediately. Sorry, yeah. Knight to e7, this guards the pawn. Pawn to e4, this offers a trade of pawns. Okay, Black declines the trade with pawn to f4, and now the center is locked, but the d file is still open. Knight to f3, attacking this new weakness on e5. Okay, knight to c6, protecting e5. Pawn to c3. This kind of limits the knight's movement. King to g8. Okay. Rook to d1, taking control of the d file again. Pawn to a5, just pushing a pawn. Rook to d2. King to f8. King to d1. Rook to g7. King to e1. King to e7. And pawn to a4. Now black also advances his king further with king to e6. He just okay. King to f2, pawn to h6, and rook to d5. This centralizes the rook. It takes advantage of this pawn, and it also puts pressure on the black position. Rook to d7, immediately offering a trade of rooks. Nepo doesn't allow a trade of rooks. Pawn to h5 and pawn to h4. King to d6. Now Nepo plays pawn to b3, king to e6, king to e2. Now black and white are just shuffling their kings. King to f6 and knight to g5, taking advantage of the outpost. King to e7, rook to d5. Now this offers a rook trade. Now if I think if black takes and takes, now the black knight is kicked out of its post, and the black knight cannot go anywhere here. It's blocked by the two pawns from going to the center, so the knight has to retreat. So Fabi declines the trade, but there is still an option of trade of rooks. Nepo interestingly retreats with his knight. Rook to g8. That attacks this pawn. Sorry. That attacks this pawn. And knight takes e5, taking advantage of the undefended pawn on e5. Okay, rook to g3. Now this attacks this pawn, and this pawn is still under threat. Okay, knight takes c6 check. Pawn takes c6. This attacks the white rook. And now the rook just takes the pawn on h5, which is hanging. Rook takes g2 check. King to f3. This attacks the black rook and the black pawn. And this pawn is also still hanging. Rook to g3 check. But white just takes the pawn. Now the black rook is attacked again. Rook takes c3. And rook takes a5. Rook takes b3. And pawn to h5. White now has 3 passed pawns while black has 1 passed pawn. White is up 2 points of material, but he still has to convert this endgame. All of white's pawns are separate and isolated, so white still has to be careful in this position. Rook to h3, putting pressure on the white pawn, and the white pawn cannot advance further now. Rook to f5, rook to h4 check, king to e5, rook to h2, pawn advances to a5, rook to h1 now, rook to g5, rook to a1. Now this attacks the white pawn, and so white just checks the black king. Now the black king is forced to the back rank because these squares are protected by the white king. So the Nepo bot plays king to f8 and rook to a7, protecting the pawn. Now king to g8. I think Fabi is just shuffling here. Pawn to a6. Now the white pawn is just 2 steps away from promotion, but the rook is in the way. Now pawn to c5. Black finally advances his passed pawn. Pawn to h6. Now the white pawn are very menacing. Pawn to c4 and king to d4, attacking black's passed pawn immediately. Pawn to c3, the pawn sacrifices itself. White takes. And rook to c1 check. King to d4, rook to c6, and attacking white's passed pawn. Now, white plays rook to g7 check, king to f8, and white's a pawn just continues on its path. Now, Fabi plays rook takes h6. Now, the white rook is hanging, but white promotes to a queen with a8 equal queen check. The king takes the white rook, and now white advances the white advances the e pawn to e5. Rook to g6 and queen to e4. King to h8. This is a very neat trap. Like, if white takes the rook, it is actually a draw by stalemate because the black king cannot move anywhere. So white just ignores this and pushes his pawn. Rook to g8. Okay. Queen to e5 check. Oh, sorry. Oh, what's wrong? Okay. Queen to e5 check. King to h7. Queen to h5 check. King to g7. Now, what white can do is white can just play this, and after the king moves somewhere, can take the pawn. She can take the rook, and the white king can support the pawn. But instead, Nepo just goes for a clean win. Okay, queen to f7 check, king to h8, and the pawn advances mercilessly. So rook to g4 check. Fabi bot just delays the game with checks. King to d5 check. Rook to g5 check. King to e6. And I think a good option, like a good try here, was this check. If black takes, it's stalemate. But anyway, rook to e5 check. Now remember, the white queen is protecting all of these squares and the black king cannot move. So if king takes the rook in any way, then it's actually stalemate. So Nepo bot avoids the trade. Rook to e3 and e8 equal queen check. Now it's game over for black. So rook takes is the only move. Queen takes check. King to a h7, and the white king just comes to deliver the blow. Now king to g7 and king to f5. King back to h7 and king to f6. Black kills himself, but it's basically winning for white, so black just ends the game with king to h6, and finally white checkmates with queen to h8 mate. Nepo has won this battle, this board battle, but if this video gets, let's say, one like, then I'll make another video showing the rematch with Fabi as white and Nepo as black. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you end up liking my content, then you can press the subscribe button, and you can also like this video and comment down below what I should do next and your suggestions.